Hey, Composing Gloves here, and this is a recording basics video. We're going to be looking at analog systems and digital systems, or basically how they combine, because we are concerned with recording audio onto our computer. And these days, that's pretty much how it's done professionally. Like, you are recording audio digitally. It used to be quite a hot debate and it still rages today, but it's substantially less hot on if analog sounds better than digital. Every professional I've ever talked to has pretty much agreed. They all record digital, and they admit that purists exist out there somewhere who record only to like tape or whatever medium they like to use, but that's kind of rare. So let's talk about this. So I am sitting in a room and I'm talking, and as I'm talking, I want to record it. So I put a microphone in this room so I can record it. I put what's called a dynamic microphone in my room, but the microphone's job, it's what it's supposed to do is it takes the acoustic pressure in a room and it will transform it into an electrical signal going down a wire. I actually happen to have actually made this particular wire, and so it's going down this wire. But what exactly is going down this wire? That is where we enter the analog domain. So when it's moving as electricity, that is the analog domain. When it's moving as numbers, that is the digital domain. So binary, digital, voltage is variations in voltage is analog. So what's going on inside this particular mic, it varies from mic to mic, the methods they use. Some of them are actually quite creative, but there's really two main methods. This is one of them. There is a coil in this microphone attached to a diaphragm, and there's a magnet in the middle and a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on. As it moves back and forth, it will induce a current, and depending on how much sound pressure hits the capsule, and there's different types of capsules and stuff too, but depending on how much pressure hits this moving coil, well, that will determine how much the coil moves. So it is replicating the variations in my voice only in an electrical signal. And of course, there's a huge number of things that get into this, where you place the mic, how the sound enters the mic, from what sides. It gets quite complicated quite fast, but that's like the basic idea. It's creating a variation in voltage equivalent to the variation in my voice. So now we have a replica of it, and this is analog. So it's gone into this. It's now analog. It is electricity. And now we can send it through systems. Now, people will say that analog systems sound better because it is continuous and also it's non-linear. So what does that mean? What do those two things mean? The second one's a little less spoken about, as is the first one, as a blow against digital audio. But basically, for every variation of my voice, there is a proportional variation in the capsule's movement. It is continuous. The capsule has no spot where it gets stuck. It can't make a particular movement except for its physical limitations. So it moves back and forth according to my voice continuously. And that's going to be important as we get into digital. The other thing about nonlinearities is, because it exists in the physical realm, there are things that will happen, and they're attributed to, just various phenomena that happen physically. And so it cannot reproduce the exact same motion every single time, even if presented with the same circumstances. That's like one of the weird things about analog recording. So people like analog gear because processing audio through it comes out just a tinge different every time. And so in that way, people will give personality to particular pieces of gear. They'll say, oh, it sounds like this because this is what happens when you put it in there. So that's a little aside from what we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to move back into the recording. So once it gets in there and we have this path accomplished, the analog, we reach the digital domain. And this is where bit depth and sample rate and stuff like that come in. But basically what happens is you're probably using a Delta Sigma modulator converter. Most people don't use flash converters because they suck, pretty much. It's like at the end of the day, it's just the truth. There are some variations on designs that make them sound okay, but you're probably wondering, what the junk are you even talking about? So basically, we have this continuous signal, and the reason why we want to record it digitally, well, the computers can't do that. Computers must have a spot where it ends, where this is it, this is what it represents. And so what we came up with was, hey, why don't we record the variation in voltage at a rate and we give a number for the intensity of a voltage at any particular moment in time. And of course, we have to do this consistently because the thing about audio is it's got to be reproducible over time. So it's got to be relative to time. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes into this. I'm going to point you to my digital audio basics series. But basically, at the end of the day, they said we will record the variation in voltage, and the rate at which we record it will be called the sample rate, and the rate and the number of bits used to describe how loud something is at a particular moment, that will be called the bit depth. Now, again, I'm relying on you having watched that other series, but it means a whole lot of interesting things when you really get into it. So we're basically, all I'm saying is there are levels. So let's say that we've got signal that's going like this, up and down. Well, we must take a bunch of samples at each point, and it's not as simple as drawing lines through the samples. People think that, but the math, that's not how it works. It's a complete lie. People have all sorts of weird ideas about how bit depth, more levels make smoother audio and stuff like that. It really just reduces the noise floor for a bunch of very complicated reasons. So there's just a load of really sort of interesting things that come into here. But at the end of the day, there are levels that things must conform to, but it's not in that sort of a method. It determines dynamic range, but there are other issues. So most people look at those issues, but there are other ones. There are ones when you convert to digital systems that involve their own nonlinearities. So when we're going from an analog domain, that's what I want to focus on. I don't want to focus on all that other sort of more in-depth weird stuff. You can go check that out on my channel. If you think I'm like dead wrong, you can comment and say why I'm dead wrong, but I'll probably try and explain myself because I've done like a fair amount of research about this, and I've gone to classes for this and stuff. So I'm not like stupid when it comes to this sort of a thing. Now, I better not be if I'm making tutorials. So there's this process that we have to convert it to numbers. You can see there's all these levels. It has to be digital. It's not continuous like our analog counterpart. Now, you should be happy to know that if you buy decent gear that's, reputable, and you follow general practices, you're going to get a signal that will theoretically represent it perfectly. They've pretty much got it figured out. They're of course always looking for ways to improve it, but for the most part, it's pretty much figured out. And you can be happy with that. Most people, if you ask a professional and you're going to be doing digital audio work, they're going to say record at 32-bit floating points if you can, but 24-bit is fine too. And you're going to want to record at a sample rate of 44.1 as your low end. Most people, if you're doing like film, they'll do 48 as a sample rate. If you're doing, high quality, maybe you're recording an album, people will go up to 88.2 or whatever it is. It's double the original. So they just want that for a lot of other reasons that you can go check out. But basically, in the analog domain, we've got this continuous signal. Now, it has to go through something called a USB audio interface or some sort of a converter. It's got to go through through an analog to digital converter, and it's got to go back through this converter when it comes as digital to analog, when it has to come out your speakers again. It's got to be transformed back from numbers into analog signal. And there's a huge number of ways. I'm not going to get into all the different design. That's like a whole course. So we're not going to be talking about all that because we just want to get over the basics. But I want you to be a little bit aware that something like this is a Scarlatti 6i6. That's what its job is. And it uses, I'm not sure of the Scarlatti series on their own, but most systems today are what's called multi-bit modular. And they're low bit converters, but they encode full bit systems. Like they can encode. It's a little bit confusing because they'll spit out 16-bit code, but they'll use it by using they'll use delta sigma modulation, and that will allow them to encode something with a few bits a lot more accurately and spit out a representation at a larger bit depth. So when you're recording at 16 bits, what that used to mean and what it means now has changed. That's basically all I'm saying. I'm not like an expert on this, but it's kind of, when I was reading about this, I was pretty shocked because that's like how most gear works today. Otherwise, everyone's gear would just suck in comparison to the gear we have now, which is why we have this gear, not that old gear, because they've really spruced up the way these conversions happen, because that the components that take a signal to record it are by nature analog, and so they're subject to these non-linearities and things. And if there's one thing that screws up audio, is the fact that it's written in binary in a 0 and a 1. All of a sudden, if you change a 0 for a 1 or a 1 for a 0, you're going to have some issues. You're going to notice some substantial changes often. Now, if we get into where that bit lands in the signal, if it's a significant bit or not so, or a less significant bit, their least significant bit's the last one. Whatever those, if it's down there in the chain, then it's not so noticeable. It's still noticeable, and there are other ways of fixing stuff like that. But if it's up there at the front, we've got a serious issue. And so they've come up with systems to help prevent errors of that nature. There's error correction. There's all sorts of cool stuff that's built into this process, but I just want you to be aware of it, because when you're buying a piece of gear, you may be wondering, why the junk am I paying so much money for a converter? Like, I don't get it. And that's only part of the equation too. The ability for it to reach a higher sample rate and the method it uses will often determine how expensive a piece of gear is and the components they use to do it. The better you can make your analog component essentially perfect, the way better your recordings will come out. They'll just sound really nice, really clean. And there's another there's another thing in here that we haven't talked about. That's preamps. And those are also really important. And we'll probably talk about those. I'll talk about them right now. So as they're coming in, right, our signal's coming in. It's got to go through an amplifier as well, because a microphone puts out a really, really soft signal most of the time. There are, of course, exceptions, and there's always weird sort of anomalies. But for the most part, you're going to need a preamp. If you're using a line level signal, sometimes you'll need a pad, and as the very opposite of what you would think sometimes, especially if you're running it through an amplifier already. But that's like stuff where we'll approach at a later date. And actually, I probably won't even approach it in this series, because we're just trying to get signal into your computer so you can record. I'll let you deal with all that fun stuff of your particular situation later. But basically, the preamp is a circuit that will amplify your signal. And of course, if you amplify it with crappy components using crappy methods, you're going to get a crappy signal. It's pretty simple. Even if your recording was phenomenal, if you have a crappy preamp, it's not going to sound as good as it could. And if it's crappy enough, it can make a great performance sound like crap. If you have a great preamp and you have a crappy performance, well, you have crap. You're sending in crap, so you're only going to get crap. But you definitely want to have a nice preamp. I use the Scarlatti preamps. I think they sound great. I've had the external preamps, the API Lunchbox preamps. They're all just different amplifiers they're just different preamps, and they have different sounds because they use different components and are built differently. It's literally that simple. And as far as preamps go, microphones sound really different, but I've done a huge microphone shootout. One day I'll upload it where you can listen to a piano on a bunch of different mics, and it sounds different, but I felt like there were some things that we could have done. Like we put all these mics on a piano. I feel like we should have done a variety of sources to really get a feel for what they each sounded like. But on the piano, so it was quite hard to tell the differences between some. They sounded very similar. Preamps, for me, are a little bit of a different story. I've not had two that sound very similar. They almost always sound pretty distinctly different. They sound very different on the same sound source. And so that's something that's like, if you're going to look at preamps, I highly encourage maybe you look up a blog or something. I've not done this because I've had the luxury of actually being in places where they had loads of preamps and we could just listen to a whole bunch of different preamps on the same source. And I'm not saying that microphones don't sound different. They absolutely do. And the ones we picked influence that. That's why I feel like I'd want to continue to mess around with that. And it's really important that you get a sonic library for microphones and what they're used for personally rather than textbook answers. But I'm just saying that I noticed a bigger difference with different preamps than I did with that. And one thing that I did notice is we were running an API Lunchbox preamp against the Neve. Not the Neve. What were we using? An SSL. We were using an SSL console. And I liked the console more than I did the API. And it was pretty split in the room. It depended. This is a situation where it would depend on what you're recording is which one you would pick. Now, at home, obviously, I just have the Focusrite, the Scarlatti preamps. And they sound great. I've used them on tons of recordings. And so I have no complaints. They've done what I wanted them to do. And so in that way, you just got to find something that's quality and use it and just make sure that it sounds good. You don't want to be buying like gear. Things you probably should stay away from. I've heard really bad stuff about M boxes. If you buy a nice one, then good for you. But yeah, and buying gear that's up to date, that's recent gear, does make a difference because it's got better technology usually employed in it, as so long as you're buying from like a reputable manufacturer. Now, if you're going for like the cheap end of things, I totally recommend a Focusrite, maybe a 2i2. I have a 6i6 that served me super, and I just wanted more options, so I just upgraded to a bigger preamp, and it's also good expandable, so I could get different preamps and also use those. There's a whole bunch of plugins that will emulate different preamps too. Focusrite themselves actually makes one that's pretty well known. But that's pretty much that. So hopefully you get this analog versus digital thing. And I know I just did this whole thing about preamps too. And I know I didn't give you any audio examples because honestly, it's kind of beyond the scope of a basics course. I just need you to be aware of it. When we get into advanced recording techniques, that's when I'll go out of my way to really dive in, get recordings, show you what each thing sounds like under a particular circumstance. It'll be a whole different story. But basically, that's what's going on. That's why a preamp matters. That's why the analog to digital domain matters. I threw out a ton of digital audio stuff, so if you didn't get that, you can go check it out. It is a little complicated, and you don't need to be some sort of expert. Honestly, if you just go 32-bit, unless you are working on film, then it's usually 24-bit, 48K. But if you're doing audio, just general audio, if you want to be fancy, you can do 88.2, which will be easier on your aliasing filters, and people have all sorts of opinions about things. And sometimes people will set things up actually in their system that will undo whatever high quality stuff they're doing. So there's that thing too. So a lot of these differences are pretty tiny nowadays because you're going to be buying gear that's okay. So again, you've heard my respective gear choices. PreSonus is good as a USB audio interface. As far as preamps go, I have experience working with really, really nice ones that are just like, worth thousands of dollars. So I don't actually own any of those. Those are always there. So you don't need to question stuff like that. I mean, it sounds great. It's great. So there you have it. So yeah, anyways, if you have any questions about analog versus digital, let me know. If you want to know, I don't know, that's pretty much it. That's why people like analog. As far as the whole what mediums are good for analog, because when you record it digital, you record it as a stream of numbers, and it's on your disk. It's a hard disk recorder. It's recorded onto your hard drive. Now, if you were to record, or you record an SD card or whatever you need, as long as it's fast enough to be able to record and stream audio. Now, if you're going to record onto tape, that's a different thing. Tape has all these little magnetic poles. I forgot what they were called. Biases? Whatever it's got a bunch of biases, magnetic directions. I don't know the exact name for it because I've never really recorded on tape. They have a tape machine at the studio I work at or go to regularly, but we've never really pulled it out. It's kind of a shame. We're going to pull it out later. This is school I'm talking about. So I say work there, but that's because we have clients come in all the time and I work with them, but not in a work that I get paid for. It's mostly an experience thing. So you have all these little magnetic pulses, and what a tape machine does is it's got a playhead, and it will send that voltage variation coming out of the wire onto this playhead, and it will align these pulses. And so that when you read it back over a playhead, that will take these pulses and recreate the voltage in what's called the playhead. So you have the record head and the playhead. It will then reproduce that analog signal, send it to your speakers, and then your speakers will move in and out according to the voltage variation. And of course, there's an erase head, which scatters the pulses so that it's random, essentially noise. And there's a whole bunch of science behind it. Now, part of the problem with that is it is got limited dynamic range. It cannot capture, I forgot the exact terms, but it's quite a bit less. It's 80 decibels. It's somewhere up there. It had a larger dynamic range than was previously available via wire, but nowadays we have not via wire. They used to record on the wire. I forgot. I don't know about that stuff. We don't use that stuff anymore. It's a history thing. They went from cylinders to wire recorders, and then we found tape, and then hard disk recorders came along. I believe that's the order it came in. But anyways, that's that. If you have any questions, let me know. Support me on Patreon, subscribe, and have a blessed day. We're going to be going over how to load samples in the channel in the channel rack without using your mouse. So I am going to cheat real quick. Hold down control. Okay, so wait, back up. So we're going to be working on how to really make browsing which is more effective and how to load samples. Now, this you might find ways. I personally think there's faster ways when you do incorporate your mouse, but there are definitely